Hello, everybody, and welcome back to a collaboration between Rev Left Radio and Deep into History. This is a very exciting episode that's long overdue. I've long been a fan of Deep into History, both of the social media platform voice as well as the actual history of the podcast itself. So it's very cool to finally hook up with you and do a collaboration with you. And we're going to focus on somebody who is a giant in American history, in communist history, in black liberation history, somebody that has inspired you and I very deeply, which is Fred Hampton. So we're going to discuss the historical context that gave rise to the Black Panthers and eventually Fred Hampton. We're going to talk about Fred Hampton, and then we're going to see where the conversation goes. But for people who might not be fully aware of you and your project, can you sort of introduce yourself and introduce Deep into History and give people a little idea about what it is you do?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me on, Brett. I've been a huge fan for a very, very long time, so it's an absolute honor to be here.
Thank you.
I host the podcast Deep into History. I create historically accurate narratives and synthesize them into classic tales that are akin to fairy tales but are all fact, so that history becomes accessible. So that once you hear it, it's and you can reference it, so that it sticks with you. And I've found so often that history is used against us, and this history has been used to divide us, and that's just because we can't recall it, because it's very hard to recall a name or a date sometimes, but you can always recall emotion. So I try to bring out the historical resonance of events ranging back from ancient times to our modern era.
And you do it incredibly well. And yeah, like the element of storytelling and how that is an art and a science in its own right is something I think that really manifests with your work in particular, how good you are at it. And I think we're both focused on, and I've always thought of Rev Left this way as well, as like there's the intellectual knowledge that we need to know, but this is not dry merely intellectual stuff. The stuff we're talking about, it comes from the heart as well. And so if we can infuse our history with the emotive force of emotions, of pain, of compassion, of love, of rage, just knowing human beings and how psychology works, those emotional iterations, when they're not cynical, when they are authentic, can help flesh out the intellectual stuff and make you remember it more. Our memories and what we actually internalize are deeply connected to our emotional states. And the most emotionally intense things you've ever experienced are often the things you remember the most about. And so, I think it's really important and something that you and I both try to do, and you do very well, which is to infuse the history with the emotional stakes that this history is about. This is not just dry, dead stuff we're going over in a monotone voice. This is our history. This is our tradition. This is humanity fighting, and it should be imbued with the emotions that deserves. And another thing I wanted to say up front too is you are a friend of Michael Brooks. And Michael Brooks, we're coming up, I believe, as you told me before we started recording, on the 3-year anniversary of his death. And so I think both of us talked about dedicating this episode to Michael Brooks, who was a really principled voice on the left and in the YouTube space in particular. He was just a good guy. And we don't want to forget one of our own. So we salute Michael Brooks and we keep him in our memory.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Rest in power, brother.
Totally. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get into the topic at hand. So again, I think this first half of this conversation, as it is on your wonderful episode of Deep into History entitled Fred Said, the first half is really this historical contextualizing, the several decades leading up to the civil rights movement, leading up to the Black Panther Party and the rise of figures like Fred Hampton and many others. So let's go ahead and start wherever you want to start. You can usher us into this historical context part of the conversation.
Okay, awesome. Well, I wanted to, I like to give context so that we can understand not only, on any given subject, not only what someone did, but why they did what they did. And the only way, especially the closer we are to our time, the historical resonance is much stronger. So, Brett, if it's okay with you, I'll kind of tie things together that kind of defined Fred's life.
Yeah.
Okay, so where my episode begins and where my research really began was the 1917 Russian Revolution. Which obviously the communist revolution that overthrew the Tsarist government, sparked quite a reaction in the bastion of capitalism in America. Because the idea that, Russian peasants and workers, could overthrow, a monarchy gave the 1%, the capitalists, the ruling class in America, great fear that their peasants and workers could attain the same kind of solidarity and revolt against a very unfair system. And there was quite a panic, which led to the passing of something called the Sedition Act, in 1918. Which basically gave the government carte blanche to crack down on anything in essence seen as subversive. But particularly there was one clause in it where that said that any action that interrupted the production of war material could immediately be cracked down upon. And in the context of that era, at that time, there were many different ideas going around about how to organize a government, and I'm talking not just internationally, but in America. There were, communist movements, socialist movements that were gaining credence, but most of them that were, left of center were all centered around union organizing. The capitalists saw the union organization as basically a stepping stone to communism. Yeah. So this was played up in the media, to a huge level. And the Attorney General at the time, Palmer, launched a series of raids, which, basically is called the first Red Scare. Mm-hmm. The idea that, if any kind of socialist communist idea or any really leftist organizing principle were allowed to exist, then America would become communist. A ridiculous assumption, of course. History's proved that, but at the time, in the context of that kind of fever dream driven by fear, the politics of fear, and the media narratives driven by fear, it really took hold. And in the context of the civil rights movement, this resulted in a series of raids, the Palmer raids, that cracked down brutally on union organizing, like literal torture of people. And of course, the very, very sad and tragic Red Summer of 1919. So, during World War I, tens of thousands of African Americans served in the U.S. Army fighting in Europe. And racists, the politicians, and their collaborators in the media created this narrative that African American soldiers who had returned from Europe were, in essence, communist agents, like they had been influenced by communist agents, and with the prevailing racism of the time, those two kind of married each other, resulting in horrific race riots. And we're not talking just like in the South, we're talking about cities across America, north, south, east, west, everywhere. But the thing is, because these brave men who had gone and fought in the First World War, these veterans, they knew how to fight. Mm-hmm. And they knew how to organize because of their army experience. So, for the first time, African Americans, it was disparate, but in city centers across America, they organized their communities and fought back. And that kind of, pride and, shedding of some fear formed the roots of the civil rights movements as we know it.
Yeah, so let me jump in there because I think that's incredibly important. One is the pathological fear that is inculcated in a white supremacist apartheid state where, and this happened in Haiti, this happened all throughout the colonial world, it certainly happened in the U.S., where, there would be these outward articulations of why slavery is justified, why white people are superior, race science, etc. But deep down, this repression of the shame and the understanding that this is all bullshit on some level, whether that's conscious or not, and the pathological fear and paranoia and suspicion that emerges from it has always been a hallmark of these racialized apartheid states. And when you have a bunch of black soldiers, well, we need them now to go fight these wars, right? For us, they're people we can send over and die for, U.S. interests, but they're also going to different places, going throughout Europe, where in some places, at some periods of time, they're much more racially accepting. So you get a little taste of what life could be outside, especially if you're, somebody who's lived their entire life, let's say, in poverty in the Deep South, going to Europe. It's certainly not perfect. There's hardcore racism to this day in Europe, of course, but in some instances it was a little different. I mean, James Baldwin, decades later, would find that fleeing the U.S. to Paris was where he could truly be himself, and he could get out from underneath the yoke of all of the stuff that came with not only being a black person in the U.S., but a gay person, a gay black person that spoke out against injustice, right? The deck is stacked against somebody like James Baldwin here in the U.S., and he found Paris, France to be a sort of a getaway. So that's just interesting. So they're all coming back from these wars. They have military training, organizational training, discipline, etc., and the rampant paranoia and fear of the white majority starts galloping. And another important thing is how, and this will probably be something we discuss throughout this episode, how anti-communism is tied deeply to anti-blackness, how anti-communism is tied deeply to anti-working class politics, the targeting of unions, for example. This is the time in the 19 teens where the IWW was rising to prominence, in part through their rejection of this idea that unions should only be white, right? They started breaking down the color line, accepting black workers into their unions, which was anathema at the time. They were ran by people who were explicitly and vocally communist and socialists, and then just outside of all of that, they're unions, right? They're fighting for working class politics against the politics of the bosses. And so once the revolution in Russia happened, you have not only this pathological fear of, settler colonial white supremacist apartheid state, white reaction, but now you have this fear of the specter of communism solidifying into a concrete form in the form of the Bolsheviks in Russia. And we saw with the Russian Revolution how these unions and eventually these Soviets were crucial to the victory. So the ruling class, especially since the late 1800s, when there was a shift away from like the brutal robber baron railroad times to more and more union activity, they knew they had to put the kibosh on this stuff. And after the Russian Revolution, the need to put the kibosh on it just ratcheted up to 10, and all of the pathologies of white reactionaries in the U.S. came out in full force, and that's just one example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, and it's important to note that during that Red Summer, it wasn't just like the worst reactionary elements, like the fever pitch, the hysteria had grown and was fostered to grow to a point where it was ordinary, someone you probably wouldn't even consider like racist in the context of the day. Mm-hmm. Ordinary white people attacking black people because of that fear. Like, it's almost as if, we'll get to this later, but it's almost as if that, the idea of our modern concept of race only exists because capitalism exists, right? Because it only exists to justify the slave trade and the, exploitation and murder of subject colonies around the world.
Yeah, well, really quick, just to add to that point, the idea, the modern racism that we experience today of white, supremacy, of anti-blackness, this is not merely just ideological foam on the surface of the ocean of history. This is forged through the material processes of first colonialism, which is of course the primitive accumulation phase of the development of capitalism. So after colonialism, then comes the slave trade, and then get that. Those two things, colonialism, right, the stealing of land, the extracting of resources from the global south, and the free labor that came with the chattel slave trade, was the impetus and the catalyst that allowed capitalism to come onto the scene as a world historical force. So, just the idea that racism as we think of it today was forged through this material process of colonialism, which was the primitive accumulation stage of capitalism, shows that this is inexorable from the entire process of capitalism, and that is why it still lives on with us today.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's divide and rule tactics, like very similar to a more primitive form, but like Caesar used in Gaul, or Philip of Macedon used to subjugate the Greek city-states. You keep people divided amongst based on very, very superficial reasons when they should be united. Now, when you look at it on a global scale in the context of the colonial era and the rise of capitalism, what is the easiest thing you can point to for differences between people? And it's skin color.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
But there is an upside, because what happened was, after that horrible red summer of 1919 and in 1920, the public hysteria died because it was the Red Scare was seen as largely something, that was quite literally, propped up by the media, because people saw that not just what happened to the black community, but what happened to union organizers and socialists and communists, and honestly, like what we would call like a progressive today.
Yeah.
Just for speaking out against what the government were doing, they faced such horrific consequences that something good happened. The ACLU formed and got the repeal of the Sedition Act in 1921, mm-hmm. and more insidiously, J. Edgar Hoover proved himself to be the lethal right hand of concentrated capital, and would soon be rewarded with the creation of the FBI. Mm. And so just to move it along, we enter the era, obviously the stock crash leading in 1929, leading to the Great Depression, and FDR, we enter the New Deal era. There's a lot to be said. I mean, on your show, my show, a lot of shows have talked about the details of the New Deal. And it's wonderful to learn all that stuff. But what I've found that is often missing is the concept that the New Deal itself was a social contract to save capitalism from itself.
Yes.
Because they needed to curb the rise of popularity of socialism and communism that was rising abroad, and again at home after that first purge. During the first Red Scare, and societal solidarity had congregated around FDR and his mass coalition to the point where I believe in one election they had 83% or 93% of the vote. I have it written somewhere. They had let's just say the vast majority of everyone voting in the United States voted for the Democratic Party, and this is where the whole idea of the Republican Party as the party of big business came about, because they were such a small minority. Quite literally, the only people who supported them were the elite, because what the New Deal did was basically give everyone a slice of the proverbial pie, and proved that the lie that we're constantly told that, wealth isn't a zero-sum game. Well, it absolutely is. If you don't allow capital to concentrate at the top, everyone else gets some of it.
Yes. really quickly, just to jump in, this is also the time when there was a business-led attempted coup in the planning stages against FDR. The far right called him a communist, but he saw himself as, a representative of like the liberal, progressive, but still fully capitalist class, as a defender of capitalism against communism. And now communism also has this double-edged approach to the New Deal, because domestically you had these radical unions, these socialists, these anarchists, these communists who were, rallying, giving voice to the depravity of the time leading up to and then through the Great Depression. This bottom-up organizing work is also putting pressure on the government to respond, but also externally, with the rise of the Russian Revolution, there's a real concrete fear out there that this whole system could be toppled and taken over by communists. Look what they did in Russia. And so this dual internal and external communist threat and agitation actually forced the ruling class into the New Deal, which was then, seen by them as a protector of capitalism, protecting capitalism from its own excesses, and as a way to get through the acute crisis of the Great Depression and, then eventually World War II. But what we've seen since then, and this is very important, is that anything granted under the system of bourgeois electoralism, under the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, can be and will be clawed back. So what is neoliberalism, if not the ending of the New Deal era? It was a clawing back of the gains made during that era. And today, when people say "Make America Great Again," ironically, and I made this point many times in different places, ironically, what they really mean deep down, whether they know it or not, is they want to go back to that time of prosperity. Specifically, though, we have to mention, because of the racial differences of the New Deal, this is like white middle class people were very much helped out. And in fact, part of the compromise was that a lot of these programs would not be extended to black people. And so that we can never forget that element of it. But when they say "Make America Great," they kind of want the prosperity that was undergirded by this economic, sort of left-wing populism of the New Deal. But because they don't have a critique of capital, because they're on the right, and that's definitionally true, they want to go back to that time through cultural means, right? They want to resurrect the racism and sexism and homophobia of the time, thinking that if we can reintroduce the cultural norms of the 50s and early 60s, we can somehow get back the prosperity that was undergirded by the New Deal economic policies. And this is not a conscious thought on their behalf, but if you look underneath the surface of what they're saying, this is what they're trying to do. But the main point I wanted to make, not only the racial differences of how the New Deal actually helped, certain communities while leaving other communities more or less out in the cold, but also that the New Deal was this response to an acute crisis that was then, over the several decades afterwards, clawed back by the ruling class, with the Reagan period being that period of completely dismantling the New Deal era, political safety net that we had. And if the first Red Scare de-radicalized some of the unions, right, with the Sedition Act, and they took the IWW to trial and threw a whole bunch of charges at them, and then after the IWW was more or less destroyed, you still had unions for several decades, right? Strong unions, but they were often very labor aristocratic, very, white supremacist. They went back to maintaining the status quo instead of challenging it. So this first wave of attack on unions during the teens and 20s was a de-radicalizing of the unions, taking out the communist and socialist leadership. And then with Reagan and the neoliberal order, it was, okay, we don't even want these unions to exist at all. And so it was this two-phase, multi-decade approach where you first de-radicalize the unions, and then eventually, after you've done that, decades later, you just undermine union participation altogether, and that's sort of the wreckage that we're living in today. Sorry if that was long-winded.
No, that was amazing, and you're absolutely right. Because the people today, when they say "Make America Great Again," they're obviously talking in culture war terms. Yes. Right. Like you said, they have absolutely no critique of capital or class analysis, and it's very funny to me that basically everything that they're against would actually make their lives materially better. Yes,
but it would also make the lives of poor black people materially better, and blue-haired college kids materially better. And that's the insidiousness of racism, as you were talking about earlier, the divide and conquer thing, right? Because a huge part of like libertarianism, right, with Barry Goldwater and this whole idea of states' rights used during the Jim Crow era, used during slavery, is this idea that we don't want any of our resources going to these people. And so we'll even shoot ourselves in the foot. We'll hurt poor white and working class people in order to prevent black people, people of color, or anybody we deem, not sufficiently American or human from getting any help at all. And that gave rise to what is called like drained pool politics. During desegregation, public pools were desegregated as well, allowing black people to swim with white people. And what white people did after pouring bleach in the pool and trying to terrorize black people out of public pools is simply shut down their local public pools and open up private pools with private membership so that only white people could be allowed in. Now, what did that hurt? It also hurt poor and working class white people who couldn't afford the memberships at the private pool. They just lost their public pools, right? But it's worth it for the white middle, upper middle, and elite class to keep people divided and to maintain white supremacy and segregation in their areas. And so you really cannot understand like the libertarianism as well as reaction without understanding this idea that they do not want, people that they deem less than to get things. And they'll prevent even people who look and think like them from getting things, as long as it also makes sure that those people don't get them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very strange, twisted worldview that's so fanatically adhered to when they fundamentally misunderstand the entire premise of their argument. It's kind of mind blowing, and I can't help but think that it's just ignorance of history.
Yes, yeah, and the pathology of whiteness.
Absolutely, and I think to a large degree, it's so systemically reinforced that I love people. Even I'll talk to I've helped deprogram. Unfortunately, a friend's parents got into QAnon, and I kind of deprogrammed them when I asked them, do you know about the New Deal and the conspiracy to unravel it? And they went down, and I use that same terminology. Do your own research. Mm-hmm. You can ask me questions, but do your own research. And they kind of figured it out on their own. It's not hard, and it's actually more compelling.
Totally.
Because when you actually go into the actual story of our history, it's dark. The closer we get to our times, the darker it gets. I've always maintained that. It gets darker in the sense that it gets more evil because it resonates harder, and it's harder to see us making the same mistakes over and over again. But it's the only path forward. We have to face our societal demons.
Yes, there's no shortcut. The only way out is through, and we have to have a thoroughgoing confrontation with all of the injustices of society if really we hope to solve any of them. Because, as we've seen throughout American history, when you try to solve a problem but you want to exclude certain people, like in some sense the New Deal did, based on a compromise between different political factions, that you don't actually solve the issues that give rise to these big crises. And so what happens is, especially in American society, we live in these doom loops. We cycle through the same shit over and over again as we are being begged to face our shit and deal with it so we can move on, but we never do. And so we have to keep living through these reiterations of the past. And yes, they're at higher levels, right? The experiences of black people today is certainly better than 100 or 200 years ago. And that is not because white people had it in their heart to help them out. It's because of the bottom-up struggle that black people and other marginalized people have waged ever since before this country was founded. Like during the slave times before 1776, there were revolts. There were uprisings. The Amistad, or whatever that ship was called when there was a revolt on the slave ship coming back over to North America. The resistance has always been part and parcel of the oppression that has been inflicted on people. And it's in that tradition that I think we can really find pride. Not in this kindergarten ass, I pledge allegiance to the flag, this is the home of democracy and freedom bullshit, but actually looking at the people who have occupied this land, from the indigenous people to the black people to working class people of all colors who fought back against this system at home and abroad. That is a tradition that we can truly claim as our own and be genuinely proud of.
Exactly. I mean, that was so beautifully said. Freedom is not a word. It is an experience, and it's an aspiration that we have to work towards. It's not going to be given to anyone, no matter how loud you shout it. It's a fight. It's been a fight for all of human history.
Amen. But yeah, if you want to, you'll get back on track and keep bringing us through this wonderful history. It's really important.
Well, I just wanted to say that you're absolutely right. FDR, the New Deal was wonderful if you were white,
Yeah.
or as long as you weren't too dark if you were Italian. But for everyone else, it wasn't because they were basically left out of it. And as you said, it was it was interrupted by World War II and the subsequent death of FDR, thus leaving the social contract incomplete because there were elements that were supposed to come, including universal health care and other regulations and things like that. But it immediately stopped with President Truman, who actually initially initiated at the end of World War II the Second Red Scare. It's very important to note that the first Red Scare, the hysteria more or less died if we're talking on a mass scale. Right? It was it died on its own because it was wrong. What makes Red Scare 2 so different is that in a very real way, the hysteria has never been allowed to die. The second Red Scare happens in the context of Harry Truman instituting a loyalty oath to all government officials that they have to swear that they're not communists. And obviously they had a Republican Party back then too, and they took that and ran with it. Because whenever I don't know if anyone notices this, but whenever the centrists or even the leftists give the right an inch, they'll take a foot. And this led to the famous led by Senator McCarthy Senate hearings and the House Un-American Activities Committee, basically gutting American society in general of anyone who had socialist or communist leanings. And I should point out that in the meantime, the FBI had been established domestically, and the CIA was just established during the Red Scare 2. The way to look at it in the context of those two organizations in the context of class struggle are as the CIA as the international and the FBI as the domestic cat's paws of concentrated capital. Because as Brett said, if you look at subsequent history, basically all of it, even to today, when you hear words like deregulation or the death tax, it's all clawing away the last vestiges of the reforms of the New Deal. And of course, Red Scare 2 happens starts in 1947 and goes through the Korean War. And again, it's hard to, I'll move this along, but it's hard to fathom like how far the anti-communism went. It went to the point where it was like a state religion. Neighbors were reporting neighbors. We often focus on just kind of, the Hollywood Union crackdowns and things like that, because those made headlines in the context of the Senate and the House committees. But it was happening everywhere across society. In essence, anti-socialism and anti-communism had become de facto state religions. But again, after the Korean War, the fever broke and people started saying that, you know what, why are we going after these people who are just trying to live their lives? Our neighbors, our, friends, coworkers, colleagues. But this time, J. Edgar Hoover, had become a master of all things, domestic surveillance, all things that we would consider evil, created something called or A, but the at the time, the fifth column plot.
But before we move into the fifth column plot, I just wanted to make a point as well about Red Scare 2, because you said Red Scare 1 eventually died down, in part because what people really saw when the rubber hit the road was that, like, just regular people or union people were being swept up and accused of this stuff. There was no communist revolution. There was nothing close to a communist revolution. So people eventually stopped believing the nonsense. Red Scare 2, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong here, you've said, I think in this episode and others, that it never quite died down, and a big part of that is the broader geopolitical and material context of the Cold War. So after World War II, of course, once the Nazis were defeated, immediately, without even taking a breath, we moved immediately into the Cold War era, where the Soviet Union was this real concrete threat. And this Red Scare, or this period of Cold War, lasted several decades. The acute McCarthy sort of witch hunts, there was a turning against that, right? The acute McCarthyism was eventually, more people than not turned against it and saw it for what it was. But the ambient anti-communism that gave rise to McCarthyism was still incredibly present, was still incredibly useful for reactionaries and for the elite. As we said earlier, anti-communism can be used to destroy unions. Anti-communism can be used to target and label and harass and kill, black revolutionaries of various sorts. So anti-communism is a really helpful tool that the elites use. And even they can convince, like, good-hearted liberals to hate it too. And that's one of the most pernicious effects of anti-communism, is that, good-hearted progressive liberals are brainwashed from birth to be like, yeah, we want freedom and equality and everybody should be treated equally, but like not scary communist authoritarianism way. So, once you can get anti-communism to be a baseline assumption in all of society, even that element of society which pretends to be the progressive edge of society is imbued with these anti-communist ideals, which make them denouncers of the one thing that could really threaten the global and national ruling class, socialist and communist movements. And once you've done that, like, you've really completed the circle, because now the people who are the progressives in society are just as anti-communist as are the hardcore reactionaries, and that's very, very, very useful.
Absolutely. Apropos of what we were saying earlier, it's because the history is left out.
Yes.
When you hear, forget MSNBC, but even a centrist podcast or YouTuber talking about, popular one talking about the New Deal, they always leave out that, there were major communist and socialist movements at home and internationally abroad that required the New Deal to happen.
Yes.
Thus, their very progressive existence would be impossible without those communist and socialist elements.
Absolutely.
And once you learn, I'm so thankful for Rev Left Radio, because once you learn the background to these things, you can see how, our supposed, guardians of wisdom or collective wisdom, are completely uninformed. And it's really, really sad that they don't even know where their own values come from.
Yes. Could not agree more. But yeah, we were talking about the fifth column plot. I think this is really important.
Yes. The fifth column plot is devious and you have to, it's okay. I hate J. Edgar Hoover. I'm not a fan of any of these institutions like the CIA or the FBI. However, you have to, understand in the context of class struggle, you have to understand how ingenious this is. The Red Scare 2 would not be allowed to die. So Hoover created this fifth column plot, which basically he presented evidence to the president and the National Security Council, I believe Eisenhower, and said to them that there is a mass infiltration of communists from Eastern Bloc countries that are posing as Americans and are coming here to infuse our institutions so that we turn basically you'd have so many government employees that were secret communists that one day you'd wake up and America would be communist because the government is run by communists. The deep state is run by communists. A completely insane plot, but what's crucial here is for the evidence he presented showed the complete level of surveillance that Hoover's FBI had over basically everyone. And it suddenly came clear to every, basically politician or political appointee in the room, that he had dirt on anyone and everyone because he had been illegally wiretapping everyone. Civil rights and civil liberties weren't a thing for Hoover and the FBI. The president authorized the counterintelligence program, or as I'm sure everyone knows it, COINTELPRO, which was a government sanction, basically giving Hoover's FBI sanction for all the illegal activities they did before, as giving it official sanction and thus releasing what in essence was a covert war on its own people. Hoover knew, I said it in my episode, and I'll say it again because I love saying it. At this time, 1955, because of what happened during the New Deal and how many reforms were achieved, and then Red Scare 2 happened and a purging of communists, it was literally becoming quite more likely to be trampled by an elephant than to actually know a member of the Communist Party at that point in the United States. What Hoover's actual plan was to release it against the burgeoning civil rights movement. And he did so in 1968 and then expanded it with the explosion of the Vietnam War, which takes us into the 1960s, where it was released on anything that you would consider remotely progressive, or obviously anything left of center. And they threw in, just for good measure to make it look like they were doing God's work, they threw in the KKK and a couple of truly awful organizations, but it was basically directed against its own people.
Yes.
And yeah.
So let me bounce off that and have a few thoughts that come to mind. Again, this theme that anti-communism is so useful comes up again, right? Because even to this day, when you talk about universal health care, when you talk about universal housing, when you talk about free education, the first thing that you are met with, and I've been met with this my entire life, is that's socialism. That's communism, right? So now it's gotten to a point, and this is all the history that leads to this, where anything good in society is now labeled by the elites in the center and the reactionaries on the right as socialism and communism. And that's enough, and has been enough thus far, to prevent those things from coming to fruition. I think things are changing with the younger generations not because young people are bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and inherently more progressive than older people, but because millennials and Gen Z have grown up in the U.S. under material conditions that have been nothing but steep deterioration and decline, from the two insanely cruel, brutal wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, to the 2008 economic implosion, up through the resurgence of fascism, the election of Trump, the pandemic, and into today, where now the things that, I remember talking about the stuff during the Obama administration, wealth inequality, the homelessness crisis, and the need for universal health care. And a lot of people, that was just even back in the 2010s and early and late aughts, that stuff was just like, you still get an eye roll. You'd still be like, that's insane. And now, even on MSNBC, you'll hear people talking about class. You'll hear people talking about the homelessness crisis, etc. But I just wanted to focus on that part about anti-communism undermining goals today. Even like trying to address the climate crisis is immediately called communism and socialism. This is how the communists are sneaking in communism through this lie of global warming, and the only way to address it is to, challenge the capitalist system itself. So literally just trying to make our planet livable is now called communist and socialist, and you wonder why young people who have heard from the day they were born that everything good and meaningful and that would be helpful to them in their lives being slandered as communist and socialism, and now all of a sudden, over 50% of millennials and Gen Z identify as socialist and communism. It's kind of funny how that works. But I also wanted to say that the anti-communism and the idea that communists are in the government, right? This right-wing fever dream paranoia that's always present. This conspiracy thinking. Communists are in the government. What that quickly translated to, especially through the 80s and 90s, was this notion of Zog, right? The anti-Semitic conspiracy theory of a Zionist-occupied government, where it was no longer communists who were in the background and in the shadows trying to grab the levers of power, but now it was Jews, right? And this fits perfectly in line with right-wing conspiratorialism. When you don't have a critique of capital, all you're left with to explain reality is conspiracy thinking. And one of the big conspiracy movements that came out of this McCarthy Red Scare II era was the John Birch Society. So the Senate censored McCarthy and sort of marked the end of McCarthyism around 1954, 1955. By 1958, the John Birch Society is now on the scene, a direct product, I would argue, of the McCarthy era, and a hardcore anti-communist and conspiratorial group that still lives on in organizations like Turning Point USA, in the fever dream conspiracy theories of what just is right-wing politics, right? Different conspiracies, but almost everywhere you go on the political right today, it is you're being bombarded with conspiracy theories. The John Birch Society was a predecessor of QAnon, I would argue. And so we can see how this period of history that we look back on and think we're separated from, this Red Scare II and McCarthyism, actually gave rise to these movements that still live on to this very day, that are still embroiled in anti-communism, still embroiled in conspiracy fever dream politics, and that gives rise and sort of cements reaction of all kinds. So, tying the dots, connecting the dots, tying things together, this is like the dialectical analysis of history, where we don't see things as like this happened on this date, and then this thing happened on this date, and then this happened, but hey, that's all in the past now, we're in a totally different circumstance. No, we trace the present back through the past, and we see that the conditions we live in today, the dominant ideas, the political factions, the pathologies of American politics, are deeply and inexorably connected to decades and centuries of American society, which is white supremacist, which is slave and Jim Crow, which is the genocide of the Native Americans, which is anti-communist and actually elevates property and private ownership of property to the status of a god. These things are not disconnected. They are fully connected, and they live with us to this very second.
Excellently said. I mean, that was amazing. And I just like to add, if anyone wonders if any of these organizations that Breht mentioned are, intrinsically fascist, understand that their critique through conspiracy is blaming one person or one group. Therefore, the end conclusion of that is that the only thing that can save you from this is one person or one group, right? Exactly. Which is quite literally, the platter you're being served is fascism through the lens of, anti-Semitism, all this, crazy stuff. When the real conspiracy is the conspiracy to keep us divided so we can never have class solidarity. Absolutely. That we had, during the New Deal, especially now when we can be, relatively, at least better off, relatively, colorblind societally. Like if there was a second FDR today, we would be able to make those changes for everyone, right?
Yes.
Hopefully, fingers crossed. But basically it's divide and rule tactics to confuse, to blame, to discredit the idea that government can actually do something for you.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's become a governing philosophy. I mean, I would argue in America for both parties, but internationally, I'm in Canada, so like up here, we're on top of your meth lab, so the fumes have come up, and it's alive and well here too.
Yeah, absolutely. The brain rot has seeped across the border for sure.
Our capital was shut down by QAnon truckers.
Yes,
so
yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. Yes. So where were we? We had just the fifth column had entered. The civil rights movement had begun, and we have entered the 60s. Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So I'm no like I've never claimed to be an expert on the civil rights movement. However, I'm well read on it and MLK in particular. And so very, 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 very broadly, the civil rights movement can be seen as split into two wings. The kind of rural, I would say, more than southern, but southern rural, let's call it, aspect of it, which brought about the Civil Rights Bill of 1965, is centered around Martin Luther King Jr., right? But the plight of African Americans in northern cities were not addressed by addressing the injustices of Jim Crow laws, because it did nothing to really address their material conditions. I make this point at length in Fred Said, but I just want you to know that we often look, particularly mainstream media, will look back at that era and just hold up Martin Luther King, and that was it. No, there were different factions, different groups, representing different geographical eras, not to take anything away from MLK.
Right.
But this is when Fred Hampton is really becoming a politically, conscious. He's very young at this point. And I think he's 12 in 1960. And, at age 18, as the 60s go along, we are noticing, assassination after assassination. And if the way I look at it is that any person who had come to perhaps not synthesize the view, Fred's views the way he had, but anyone that seemed capable of creating societal unity, as I hate to repeat myself, but during the New Deal era, if they were able to replicate that again, they were killed in the 60s. We know the major assassinations, but I assure you, through my reading about COINTELPRO, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of more people just eliminated or discredited or ruined and destroyed because they merely presented the possibility of allowing solidarity to happen.
Mm-hmm. Really quickly, interestingly, and this might be a little ahead of us, but I think everybody's heard this phrase, the Black Messiah, right? This is what figures like, MLK, Malcolm X, and Fred Hampton were at various times described as by the FBI and COINTEL information that these are Black Messiahs. And I just wanted to point out the irony here, that almost everybody who would talk in these terms are Christians. And the idea that what the Messiah is a figure that comes back and saves people, right? It's a holy, good figure in the Christian tradition. And then without a sense of irony whatsoever, these Christian white men would talk about the Black Messiah and how we need to crucify them so that they do not save the world. As they were no doubt have crosses dangling from their necklaces, right? Talking about how the Black Messiah is this threat that we need to kill, taking literally the position of the Roman soldiers and the Roman power complex against Jesus, and now just, putting Jesus in the figure of Malcolm X or Fred Hampton, and then, virtually doing the exact same thing, crucifying that figure. It's just wild. Yeah.
It is wild, and I think they, when I don't want to give anyone too much credit. However, you have to understand the architects of the 1%, and particularly the architects of this plan. And it was a plan. COINTELPRO was a plan. MH Chaos was a plan. All these programs we know about, they were well organized, well thought out. Even as chaotic and crazy as a lot of the aspects of they were, it was planned. And I cannot help when I hear the term Black Messiah if they're not actually referring to the fact that a black person would actually be able to be a Messiah not only to blacks but to whites. Someone is particularly in the case of Fred Hampton. I think that program was with the historical, hindsight, was actually targeted specifically for someone like him, someone who completely obliterated the notion of race to the people he talked to.
Yes.
And it's really, what you said was amazing, but it's so evil and it's so dark, which is why I like staying in ancient history mostly.
Yeah. I do want to say one thing. It reminded me of this Killer Mike line. Now, Killer Mike's politics are all over the place. I'm not, saying thumbs up to everything Killer Mike believes or says, but he has this one line in one of his songs where he's like, if Jesus came back, where do you think he'd be? He'd be in these streets with me. And I see like Fred Hampton for sure, Malcolm X for sure, but MLK especially as a sort of Jesus-like figure for America, trying to redeem us of our sins, trying to save us all, as equals under the eye of God, literally coming out of the Christian tradition and immediately being, not immediately, but eventually being killed by white reactionaries. And this idea that if Jesus came back today, he'd come back as, this is the idea in these like white evangelical and white reactionaries' minds, that he would be this blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan freak that would, all of a sudden be like this multi-million-dollar pastor in a megachurch or some shit. No. If Jesus came back, he would come as the figures in society that are most hated by those with wealth and power and money. It would be a poor, black or indigenous woman, in American society today that would be most likely the form that Jesus would take if he came back. And again, I say that if Jesus literally came back in America in a form that was, commensurate with who Jesus was, it would be white Christians with crosses dangling around their neck who would crucify him once again. And so that's always stuck out with me. And the fact that they're explicitly talking in terms of the Messiah just like really, really drives this point home, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've long maintained that Jesus could have come back 100 times in the last 20 years, and he's probably dead.
Yeah, every time.
The cops probably shot him because they thought he was a crazy person.
Definitely.
Okay, so Fred, even at a young age, he's from Maywood, Illinois, which is a suburb outside of Chicago. Now, small town at the time outside of Chicago. He was a student organizer, extraordinarily well read. This boy read every single thing in his library. He basically came to the concept that Breht and I discussed earlier, that our very modern concept of race was driven out of a need to create wealth. Thus, capitalism came first and racism came second. And that once he realized that and was able to kind of verify that through historical fact, he began to formulate his political opinions. And he saw society as a mountain valley and basically came to the conclusion that unless you are at the very, very top of the mountain, so you're at the peak, then it doesn't matter where you are on the slope. You are the same as everyone else. So, today we have successfully, implemented things like the PMC and all kinds of things. Understand that, I know we'll probably never reach PMC people because of their relative level of material comfort. But you always have to take into account the fact that FDR was an elite, and it's not that those people won't listen to your ideas or that they should be hated. It is that they most likely will only act once they know that their material conditions won't be completely destroyed by any kind of revolutionary concept. And Fred Hampton got that across extraordinarily well. And before he joined the Panthers, he had woven into his speeches a word that was made famous in America. Obviously, has its roots, in Jamaica and in other places, Haiti, but Babylon. He would use the word Babylon in his speeches, and as he was talking, starting in very, very small rooms in churches, to eventually filling up a few pews in churches, to filling churches, to giving speeches in parks, suddenly he was speaking not to African Americans, but to the entire racial makeup of the city of Chicago, and soon, people were coming in from beyond. Now, the Babylon, the way Fred said it and the way Fred used it, was very different. How should I say this? He projected a vibe. Babylon is not a place. It's an aspiration. It's the aspiration to fulfill the political promise of mythical Babylon, where no one went hungry and the problem of one was the problem of all. And
a stand-in for communism, right? A sort of rhetorical flourish stand-in.
Exactly. But the thing that was great about Fred, I think, was that he didn't, by using Babylon as the stand-in, he didn't have to use demonized words. Exactly. Particularly communism. He hit socialism hard, but when he hit it, I read, just for anyone who hasn't, who's going to listen, I tried to recreate the vibe, and I used Fred's own words, which is why the episode is called Fred Said. So I just did my best to portray him. I hope I got it across. But Fred used socialism and communism with a particularly light touch, depending on the audience that he was talking to. We're going to get to that. But because those words had been so demonized for so long, much like now, right? Yeah. You hear people call Joe Biden a communist. Like, yeah. That's insane. It was, let's just put it, it was even more demonized back then. Yes. So his primary driving force was to put theory into practice, amplified by his rhetoric, of course, but theory into practice so that people experience socialism and love it before they even realize that it is in fact socialism. We're going to get to that, but it's quite genius.
Are you going to talk about I was going to mention the lady at the meeting, but if that's in your notes, we can.
Yeah, no. We can do that now. So, Brett, you're talking about the Breakfast for Children's program. This is after he joins the Panthers, but yes. But yes, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, and you made this clear in your episode, Fred Said, which again I highly recommend people listen to, and we'll release it on Rev Left as well, so more people can hear it. It was really well done. But you mentioned that at this meeting, he's talking all this talk, and this lady gets up and she says basically, and I'm paraphrasing, but I don't know how I feel about socialism and communism, right? I'm a little ambivalent. I'm conflicted. Obviously, this person has been raised in American society. Most people, your default is to hate and fear that stuff, and you have to do a lot of work to come to a real understanding and embrace of it, of course. So, I don't know about all of that, but what I do know is that the Black Panthers provide food for my babies, for my children. And that's all I need to know. And that is so powerful for so many different reasons. It shows that serving the people through material means it will do infinitely more than a million hours of trying to convince people through rhetoric and ideas. But also it still lives on today. So I have some friends who are organized in the, Omaha Tenants Union, Omaha Tenants United, that do great work, helping, and have for several years at this point. Just helping tenants who are being screwed over by landlords of, ill repute. They go to bat for them. So if you need somebody to help you either organize tenants into a union or simply push back on a shitty slum lord who's trying to take your deposit, these people show up. And one of the things, that they've said and their experiences, and I've heard in other places as well, is like people would just not know, not even like be against, but just not know communism and socialism. Those are buzzwords, that has whatever. But when they see the communists and the socialists showing up to get their $500 deposit back, that's more convincing that these are the good guys than, again, a million hours of trying to convince people talking about historical and dialectical materialism and what Engels and Marx said. Those things are essential, and those are the things that inform people like Fred Hampton. But it's the meeting people's material needs that will be infinitely more convincing than hours of rhetorical argument. Now, I would also say, of course, not to dismiss rhetorical argument, because that's political education. And political education is what inspires people and what informs people enough to go out and do the actual praxis, do the organizing, meet people's material needs, right? But it just shows this dialectical relationship between the two. Yes, you need political education, and that's something Fred Hampton emphasized all the time. But political education without any organization, without any movement, is just talking, right? You need to actually meet people where they are and meet their material needs, and those two things then bolster each other. They strengthen one another. But if you just have organization without education, or just education without organization, you are at best incredibly limited, and at worst will fall apart. I mean, what is a revolutionary without education? He's a criminal. What is somebody that is really great on the education but doesn't do anything? They're an armchair theorist, right? You need both pieces. And Fred Hampton was always and everywhere emphasizing that point. And just that little anecdote though about the lady standing up saying, "I don't know about all this communism, Marxism stuff, but I'm 100% on your side because you feed my kids." That is so powerful.
It absolutely so powerful, and it just shows you that like how relatively little it takes to undo. Consider the times. Like when I said that, like anti-communism had become practically a state religion. Like it was true. Like yes. Literally, you would have your life destroyed if Breht were talking today in 1955, he would have serious problems, folks. Like it wouldn't. So yeah, like the thing is that you if you give people things that are fundamentally good for them, they will take it, enjoy it, love it, and then you can break it to them.
Yes.
That. Actually, this comes through the program that we're offering is based on socialistic ideas, communist ideas, through the writings of Lenin, Marx, whoever, and then you can bring them into the educational system, which was a huge part of Fred's things too. But it's the carrot, and then what I would call the bigger carrot, which is like mental liberation.
Right.
So yeah, it was like you said, it was a great anecdote. And he did so much good. And well, you know what? We got ahead. Let me just I'll jump ahead here. So like, okay. Well, let's go to 1968. Sure. Right, which I think is a kind of I'm going to do an episode on 1968 soon on Deep into History, because I think it was a turning point for America.
Yes.
And just like a very brief history, because that was a momentous year. In January 1968, the Tet Offensive happens in Vietnam. I'm not going to go into the Tet Offensive, but it was live on television on all news networks, showing this massive North Vietnamese offensive, and put the lie to the idea that Americans were winning the war in Vietnam. This sparked massive protests. So protests had been happening on campuses before, and some of them had turned violent. But for the most part, they were peaceful and not organized to happen all at once. There was no like kind of inter-university solidarity. Suddenly, because of this huge event, anti-war activists, feminists, anti-racist, pro-healthcare / abortion activists started marching together. It started fostering unity. So, so much so, not just in the United States, that students around the world began marching in solidarity, in London, Paris, New Delhi, and even in Eastern Bloc countries, students were marching against human rights abuses and, the abuses of the communist elite at the time. Long story, but we'll get into that. We can get into that another time. But basically, there was a lot of abuse of power going on in a lot of the buffer countries, as Stalin would have called them, of the Iron Curtain.
Yeah, and importantly, every, socialist republic was very different. There was a wide range of governments and ways of dealing with issues, some much better than others. So it's a very complicated history, and any socialist and communist movement is going to have within itself enormous amounts of contradictions and issues and mistakes and failures and things to wade through. So yeah, we don't need to go too deep into it, but suffice it to say that not every single person in any communist country who was dissatisfied with their government was a CIA stooge or a fascist. There were, regular ass people who, for various reasons in different places and times, had problems with the government and would speak out about it. So, I just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All of these student protests, in the capitalist West, in Asia, in communist East, it really worried the powers that be, because it seemed like a spirit of revolution was coming to the world again, among the young particularly. Mm-hmm. And if you want to understand how, like, the class struggle is the one struggle that the 1% always pays attention to, you can see it in 1968 in the reaction to these protests. Through the COINTELPRO connections fostered by a decade with local police departments, sheriff departments, and whatnot, the rhetoric in the daily briefings at police departments changed. So for the most part, student protests, the police would be there, but they just, let them march by. Who cares? They're students. We're just here to make sure they don't, vandalize property, basically.
Yeah.
But when you change the rhetorical daily briefing, pitting blue-collared policemen against spoiled rich kids, college kids, suddenly a hatred develops. It's more of a divide, and where so often these protests had just been allowed to walk by, suddenly they were met by phalanxes of policemen. And we just lived through BLM. We know what happens when a phalanx of cops is in front of you.
Yes.
Violence ensues.
Totally.
So very quickly
really quick though, I just wanted you to spark this little thought in my head. This reminder. This is actually in 1970. Like the Kent State massacre was in 1970, where the state opened up firing on students for protesting the Vietnam War. And there's also the Hard Hat Riot in 1970. You're talking about pitting like blue collar workers against student protesters who were framed as like extra privileged. And we still hear that today with like student debt relief. They pretend like every person who got a college degree is some like lawyer or trust fund kid or doctor who's just going to make $100,000 next year. And we shouldn't, as opposed to all these working class people who don't have that, when in reality, the people that take out student loans are like working class kids who want an education. But yeah, the Hard Hat Riot was like the culmination of this idea where like, regular ass construction workers and office workers went out and attacked, 1,000 or so, demonstrators, students, doing protests against the Vietnam War. So it's really sad when that happens from our perspective, but from the perspective of the ruling class, nothing could be sweeter than seeing, this. Yeah.
I'm trying to like embrace my inner optimate and start saying that, yeah, man, that would be a call for like a dry martini, because yes, it's divide and rule of the most delicious kind.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Literally, most students are of the working class, just trying to educate themselves, and then to be beaten down for your own people.
Mm-hmm.
absent a degree. That's all it is. Like a little bit of education. That's all it is. And yeah, it's so easy to divide us.
Yes.
Right? The 1% has to do one thing: maintain their position at the top. That's it. All of us have to handle everything else.
Exactly.
And every single one of us has different ideas of how to do it.
Exactly.
It's divide and rule it's brutal.
And the rich understand class struggle. They've always understand class solidarity. They've always understood it all through history. They've understood that, they share economic interests, and when push comes to shove, despite their differences or whether they're different industries or whatever, that they're going to have each other's back. And the working classes, because of racism, because of, homophobia and xenophobia and every sort of, bigotry and prejudice that is inflamed in capitalist societies, it keeps us, divided against each other. And the enormity of our task is such that even if we were all on the same page tomorrow, it would still be a world historical, burden for us to do global revolution or even a revolution in like a hardcore capitalist country. So as long as they can keep us fighting amongst each other, and like that's the beauty of the two-party system as well, is that they're both arms of the ruling class, but they pretend to have these vociferous debates which turns somebody against somebody else. So your neighbor who works, or your coworker, they have the same income, they live in the same house, they, have the same interests, but now we hate each other because, one guy has a Joe Biden hat and one guy has a Make America Great Again hat. And so instead of going after the elites, now we're out in the front yard throwing fists at each other. And it's not to say that there aren't contradictions we have to work through. Of course there are real differences. But turning neighbors on neighbors, pitting people against people, making the working class hate other factions of the working class. This has always been the strategy, and it's always been successful. So they're going to keep going with it as long as they can. And today we see Democrats, like, liberals, actually weaponizing the language of identity politics, of progressive politics, weaponizing that against people who are interested in class and anti-imperialist politics, right? So it's actually fascinating how the ruling class can even co-opt the language of progress and weaponize it against their class enemies. It's amazing, but it needs to be understood and studied by those of us who are interested in confronting this system.
Absolutely. And the thing is, like, it may look like, and they are masters of chess, but we can all learn how to play chess.
Yeah.
The thing is that we're playing checkers. That's what divide and rule and the politics of fear, like all these things together, they're playing a different game.
Yes.
Quite literally.
Definitely.
To go on with 1968. Sadly, there's the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, which basically realistically made it seem that the adoption of any progressive worldview could not be achieved within the system, particularly for Fred Hampton and for the students that went to protest the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. This is 1968. I just wanted to point out that all of these organizations that we're talking about are utterly riddled with paid FBI informants and planted undercover agents. So after the death of MLK, Fred Hampton isn't a Black Panther yet. But what happens is that future Congressman Bobby Rush sees Fred Hampton speak and notices the fact that the crowd is unique for any African American speaking at the time to have every culture represented in quantity. And so Bobby Rush flies to Oakland to the Black Panther Party headquarters and begs them to recruit Fred. He says that he needs some resources and he can really get the revolution going. But Fred Hampton, because of his views on race, on class, and everything, he only agrees to head the Chicago chapter if he's able to change party policy and crucially change the party constitution. So he changes the word white to capitalist. The most glaring change that he made. And with the resources of the Black Panther Party, I mean, we could talk about this for a very long time, but the Black Panther Party gave him access to resources such as money for printing presses, where they would start printing their newspapers, which they could then in turn sell, which gave him his own economy and literal connection to the community, to start launching his programs. And in his speeches, I call it, his truth about race, that, race was a lie, and what it is the class struggle, the rich versus the vast poor masses. It spread like wildfire. It's really unbelievable considering the fact that, he was so young, and all of these leaders that had come before them in the 60s, had never quite hit that moment. They were assassinated despite the fact they'd never actually said what he said. And basically recharacterized the Black Panther Party as the vanguard party in an international struggle for a few basic points: land, bread, clothing, education, justice, and peace for everyone, everywhere. And that is revolution. Revolution is just change. Taking it from everyone the vast masses being poor, to the vast masses not starving to death and being able to access things like education, healthcare, and live a life of decency no matter what they do.
Yes.
Yeah. And he did this by putting theory into practice. And the ways these manifested were his education program, which was quite extensive, legal assistance, which came, not coincidentally because it was Fred, through largely white, progressive, left-leaning white lawyers who offered legal assistance to him. And what became the gold standards for bringing people into the revolution, which was the Breakfast for Children's program and free medical clinics. And like we just alluded to, without using the politically demonized words of communism or socialism, instead he let people experience those systems in the context of the breakfast and the free medical care. And then he let them know that if they wanted to know more, they could learn the truth by entering without joining, but those classes were available. Political education was available to everyone. And just as you said, Brett, he had pointed out, Papa Doc in Haiti, Jomo Kenyatta, all these dictators who had come to power with, leftist rhetoric, but were basically had left everyone, all the people, uneducated. Therefore, they became tyrants themselves. Right? Yes. Is doomed to happen.
And I think it was Thomas Sankara, another hero of the Marxist left and Black liberation, Pan-Africanist. His exact quote was, "Without political education, a soldier is only a potential criminal." And I think that applies perfectly to the Papa Doc situation and the figures that Fred Hampton himself were pointing out as examples of this. So Fred Hampton in the slums of Chicago and Thomas Sankara over in Burkina Faso, coming to the exact same conclusion through their understanding of Marxist theory. It's just beautiful.
Absolutely. And and through his speeches, he explained to, particularly understand, like in the Panthers themselves, even once he'd started his chapter and it started growing, Panthers from other chapters came there and, they would confront him, saying that, it's about race. It's not about, it's not about, an international struggle. And then he would educate them about the fact that African American struggle in America are exactly the same as any any society that had experienced the ravages of colonialism, because the exact same divides that exist in America exist everywhere that colonialism happened. Like, I got news for people who don't know this. Like, my parents, I was born in Canada, but my parents are from India. If you're lighter skinned in India, like, it doesn't matter where you're from, you're automatically seen as higher up. You know what I mean? Like, these things have become so pervasive, these cultural notions, but also the ravages that exist in the quote unquote third world, are very much akin to the ravages of, the inner cities in America. Absolutely. And now, unfortunately, many rural towns in America.
Yeah. And, quickly about the black nationalist aspect. This is obviously a contradiction that existed within the Black Panther Party that they had to work through. And it's a contradiction that has existed as long as, Marxism has existed, which is this fight between black nationalists and, black Marxists. The thing is that black Marxists, in our theory, in Marxist theory, there's plenty of room for progressive nationalist liberation struggle. So, like, the black nationalist, the best of that critique and that analysis is already included in the Marxist critique and theoretical understanding of revolutionary struggle. But sometimes in the Black Panther Party, and to this day, there exists black nationalists who, the room for class struggle is not inherent in the black nationalist project. It can be added, and I think it's stronger when it is, but there are plenty of black nationalists who do not incorporate, proletarian struggle and the ideas of socialism and communism into their analysis. So I would just say that from that alone, again, not dismissing the importance and the progressive force of black nationalism historically and presently, but just to say that in Marxist understanding, there is already room for progressive national liberation struggles that black nationalists are interested in, without all the, negatives that can often come from a black nationalist approach that eschews a class struggle and solidarity. So I think that's an important point to make.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in fact, Fred addressed them. I don't have to speak for him. Fred addressed those guys, and addressed them well and brought so many of them into the movement. And he ended up forming what was called the Rainbow Coalition. He had become so popular and his message of class solidarity so intoxicating that he formed an alliance with the Young Lords, originally a Puerto Rican street gang, that had evolved into an organization that was fighting gentrification in its neighborhood, Lincoln Park, and the Young Patriots, who I need to talk about them. So the Young Patriots flew the Confederate flag as their symbol. Okay? And I don't know if you've noticed, Brad, but like on talk shows like Tucker Carlson, you'll see talking heads always, when they bring up Fred Hampton, they'll say, well, Fred Hampton had an alliance with Nazis.
Yeah.
And they'll point to the Young Patriots. No, that's not true. That's to give you the false belief that there is a political horseshoe and that there is something in common between fascism and communism. There is nothing in common. What the Young Patriots actually were rural white people, particularly from Appalachia, but from all over the Midwest, that had come to Chicago for work. And the thing was that the way, in earlier times, every even European white ethnic group was divided into their own little blocks and communities. So these whites, although they were white, did not have any pull or could not get jobs in the very tight-knit Polish community in Chicago or the Italian community in Chicago. So they had congregated together and had kind of they had adopted the Confederate flag for a sense of historical identity, because they were treated like the quote-unquote white trash by other whites.
Yeah, they were groping for a symbol, and the imperfect and, historically weighed down symbol of the Confederate flag was sort of grasped at, largely out of perhaps whatever, ignorance, or maybe that's what they saw as like a symbol that they could use. But what was important here, and that what you just said perfectly, is that it was the material economic circumstances of them being pushed into a big city like Chicago, not being able to find good employment and therefore being deprived materially, that urged them forward to try to grasp towards something. And that's very different from being an ideological fucking Nazi who utterly replaces class with racial struggle. A core feature of Nazism of any stripe is a complete dismissal of class struggle and a replacement of it with racial struggle based on race science and the idea that there's Aryan superiority, etc. And this is not the ideological angle from which the young patriots were coming. So to say that Fred Hampton united with Nazis is not only historically wrong, it's a slap in the fucking face to Fred Hampton, who would never in a million years, line up with people who are ideologically committed to the superiority of the Aryan fucking race.
No.
So anybody who says anything like that should be immediately dismissed as a charlatan who doesn't know what the fuck they're talking about.
Yeah, and absolutely, and it shows you how history is wielded as a weapon. Because a lot of people hear that and they believe it. Mm-hmm. And they say, oh, okay, well then maybe I can, be friends. So many YouTube idiots will be like, oh, well then maybe we should be friends with Proud Boys.
Right.
Because they also think that we should have, everyone should have a house, or, whatever the argument is.
Yeah. Or this guy over here he believes in Medicare for all. He also thinks that trans people are subhumans and should be genocided, but who cares, because he agrees with us on Medicare. And then you let that asshole into an organizational party. And then now what do you have? You have that racial hatred, or that, homophobia, or that trans bigotry dividing working class people within the organization. So you do not let that sort of shit in. The bare minimum for joining, in my opinion, a left-wing organization of any sort, the bare minimum is recognizing that all other human beings are fundamentally equal and that we only get what we want by getting what everybody wants. If you believe in fucking basic human dignity and equality under God's eye or the eye of the cosmos, whatever your, metaphysical preference is, that basic human equality and dignity is the starting point for us to build a coalition. If you come in saying the white people are superior to black people, or straight people are superior to LGBTQ people, or whatever, you need to either be politically educated out of that belief before you're let into our organizations, or you need to be rejected outright. And I think that is the bare minimum. And Fred Hampton fucking knew that. He knew that a lot better than these grifters today who are completely ignorant of the actual history here and just want to broaden their personal brand and the crowd that is going to click on their shit for more money. And so if you say like, hey, we can bring everybody in. Yeah, you fucking don't believe that trans people should exist, or that, immigrants should be shot at the border. Well, you also believe that we should all have health care here in the U.S. So come on in. It's a big tent. And then that does not go anywhere. That falls apart immediately, because you're letting people in who see other elements of the necessary proletarian class, of the human community, of our organization. You're seeing elements of them as less than, and that is immediately going to destroy any ability for real solidarity, which is the glue that holds movements together.
Right. I like, just to synthesize everything Fred said, the class struggle is all struggles. Because in order to achieve it, and achieve victory and an equitable society for everyone on this planet, requires international solidarity on an unprecedented scale. We have to look at each other and love one another, but understand that there's moratoriums on Babylon, right? You can't just love someone who's just pouring hate at you. Yeah. You could say, okay, I don't deal with you. Move on to the next person. Mm-hmm. But apropos of what we were discussing before the show, dear listeners, we had delved a little bit into like how there's a little bit of modern conspiracy. It's kind of permeates our culture. way I found dealing with hardcore racists is usually just to call them a conspiracy theorist. And like, what do you mean? I'm like, you're racist. That's a conspiracy theory. You
Nice.
do your own research.
Yeah.
And like, they look very confused, and yeah, usually they'll figure it out. Hopefully they'll eventually figure it out. But that's you confront hate with the fundamental ludicrous proposition that hate is based on.
Yeah.
Which in this case is the actual conspiracy of our time.
Literally a conspiracy. Yeah. That's good.
Yeah. So, I thought, we'd kind of, wrap it up there. Maybe talk about anything you'd like about the legacy of Fred Hampton, because, I did not want to do a show or an episode with you about Fred's death, because understand, we all know the story, because all the forces were coalescing and clamping down around him, and he had to die because he was actually fomenting an international level of solidarity that would have actually made, it looks like as distant a dream as Babylon now, but in the late 1960s, a sense of solidarity among all working people that could actually have fostered change to our system.
Yeah.
And this is demonstrated by the fact that a few weeks before 2 weeks before he was murdered in 1969, he was basically snuck out of Chicago and driven to Saskatchewan in Canada, Regina, Saskatchewan, and spoke to a huge student movement there. So by his messages went out to not just who were speaking, people wrote down his words, particularly students. They took them back to their universities. Remember, this way pre-internet days, way probably even the mass proliferation of the telephone. A lot, and they had this desire to speak, and people were listening, and people were believing, and he had to die because he was quite literally the Black Messiah. And he had destroyed he was able to destroy everything that had divided us and keeps us divided. He was somehow able to make the people see through all that structural training and all our prejudices and everything that we're raised with. And don't take my word for it. Listen to what Fred said and read what Fred says. I'll post his original speeches on social media as well.
Beautiful.
Go through it.
And I wanted to say as well that we did an episode here on Rev Left called The Life and Legacy of Fred Hampton, where we go very deep into the life of Fred Hampton, including all the details around the death, which is grotesque on its face. Of course, what happened, he's laying in bed with his pregnant, wife, and is attacked by the police. And of course, an FBI informant had drugged him earlier, and there was all this stuff between the Chicago PD and the FBI to assassinate Fred Hampton. And we go through that in detail on our Rev Left episode, The Life and Legacy of Fred Hampton. And then, of course, you have on Deep Into History, your episode that we've been referencing throughout, called Fred Said, where you also, all the points that you've walked us through today, you spend some time on and go deeper into. And so we'll release that episode on Rev Left. We'll link to both of them in the show notes for anybody who have not heard those two episodes and are just hearing this. This conversation here is kind of a synthesis of those two episodes, and you're going to get a little bit of each, but not all of both. And so if you're interested, you can definitely go check both of those episodes out. But I did have a couple more points as my final thoughts to this wonderful episode and this wonderful discussion with you, my friend, which is, the idea that Fred Hampton was trying to do this multiracial class solidarity thing. And that is a step too far for the establishment. And there are three figures from the 60s that are giants in black liberation struggles in the U.S. and beyond, which is MLK, Malcolm X, and Fred Hampton. And to prove the thesis that it is this move into multiracial class struggle and solidarity that is the the final point that the elites will not let you cross is that in each case, it's when they made that turn in particular that they were taken out. So for Martin Luther King Jr., he was now focused on the Poor People's Campaign, this multiracial march on Washington for basic economic dignity for all peoples of all races in the United States. That's a real motherfucking threat. He had to be put down. Fred Hampton's entire thing was about bringing together a rainbow coalition of human beings who are all materially deprived under capitalism, forming solidarity, forming real organizations that meet people's material needs, and bring people together across identities for the class struggle. That was his whole thing. They killed him, murdered him in cold blood at age 21. Malcolm X is a little bit of a different figure because there's an early X and a late X. And the contradiction there is that the early X was simultaneously a real threat to the white establishment, but also a bit of a gift. Because before he starts weaving in interracial solidarity and starts taking note of anti-imperialist struggles, it's very much like the white devil this, the white devil that. And so you can put that on the TV screen, show tens of millions of white people, forget Martin Luther King. This is the real face of the civil rights movement. And, that could really scare white people into even disowning the more peaceful MLKs, right? So there's a way in which early Malcolm X, he was thrown up on the TV often, and to the white establishment, again, he was simultaneously like a real militant threat who was like arguing for the militant side of Martin Luther King's peace movement. But was also a much more convenient figure for them to throw up in front of white people's face to scare them than MLK was, because MLK is talking in terms of Christianity and talking in terms of, a dedication to peace and Gandhi, and, that makes, his whole idea is like weigh on people's consciousness, win them over. Like, we are getting beaten in the streets. We don't fight back. We let people see how brutal this system is, and that, will get us, more allies, more solidarity from people seeing how brutal this system is. And Malcolm X was taking the opposite route. But after he goes to Mecca, when he comes back and he starts, seeing, he's like, when I was there, I saw people of all races, of all nationalities, they're humbling themselves in front of God, and he began seeing the error in, a purely like black nationalist, white, we hate all white people approach, and it started shifting his approach to more anti-imperialism. He met with Castro, right? He's starting to talk about white people as equals, and that's when he had to be stopped as well. So it's very interesting to see, the line that is drawn in the sand, and how every time when these figures cross that line, and start really basing their stuff on multiracial class solidarity, is when they go too far and when they are ultimately targeted for death. And in every single one of these cases, regardless of who ended up pulling the trigger, there is historically proven FBI and police engagement every step of the way. So in Malcolm X's case, it wasn't like Fred Hampton. It wasn't the Harlem Police Department, that the NYPD that came in and killed him. It was other factions of this, Nation of Islam movement. But those figures were deep, as we found out recently in documentaries and whatnot over the last several years, deeply entrenched and engaged with the FBI. There were informants all over. So the ultimate assassination of Malcolm X cannot be said to be something wholly outside the realm of the FBI and the CIA and the state, as it were. No, the tensions that eventually boiled over into Malcolm X's assassination were deeply entwined with those forms of state power. And so in every case, there's this unifying thread of a black messiah figure coming along, and eventually, all three of these figures started off very differently, but they eventually come to the same conclusion that only through coming together as a multiracial, class movement, an anti-imperialist movement, can we actually, make change for black people in particular, and for human beings more generally. It's that line that you don't cross, and every one of them crossed it, and every one of them were murdered because of it. And I think that's one of the lessons that we can learn, but also it's very telling in what we need to do. Because if that's the thing that makes them kill, that's the thing they don't want to happen. So anybody who is trying to undermine solidarity, anybody who is trying to separate people based on race or anything else on the liberal identity politic reduction liberal side or the reactionary right side should be at least seen with lots of suspicion. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we don't take into consideration the different experiences of different identities. Like, we have to have the respect that comes with understanding the unique experiences of being black in this country, of being an immigrant in this country, of being trans or gay in this country. Understand that, respect that, and then we unite across those identities through the class struggle. And so that's really crucial. You don't just dismiss all that other stuff in favor of class because you're not taking into consideration how class actually operates, which is racialized capitalism, right? You have to take race into consideration, but class is the unifying feature. So, we can understand different experiences and different identities, but class solidarity is the glue that brings people of different nationalities and ethnicities and races together for a common cause. That's the most scary thing to the elite. And it's also the most effective way for us to actually create the change that we want to see in this world.
Totally. So well said. And yeah, never get tricked into the idea that by embracing your class or the class struggle, regardless of your relative economic level of comfort, that requires you to give up your culture. No,
Absolutely.
like history has given us all our different varieties of culture. And the beauty of being involved in the class struggle is that we can all actually begin to appreciate it absent the lens of everything that they've used to divide us.
Yes.
But yeah, that's what I meant by what I said earlier. Like, the closer we get to our time, the more dark history becomes, because it's just it's very sad that these beautiful human beings, but everyone's flawed, everyone has their own problems, but I'm talking about just Fred Hampton in particular, a beautiful human being, had to be murdered to what? So we have our crypto scams and everything's a scam now, and you can't sign into email without it being a scam email.
Right.
Like, this is the end result
For this, look around you for this. Yes.
Yeah, it's very sad.
Absolutely. Well, my friend, I think that's going to wrap it up for now. That was a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Again, I really appreciate your work. I highly encourage everybody listening who found any part of this conversation useful to go subscribe, to go like, and to go leave positive reviews for your podcast, Deep into History. More people should be aware of it. It's high quality. It's very well done. And as I was saying earlier, I get the benefit of sometimes leaning on the expertise of my guests. You actually tackle history in like this monologue style that is incredibly engaging, is entertaining, is very principled, is very objectively tethered to reality, and is imbued with this sense of storytelling that is really, really admirable. So I think you do wonderful work, and I can't applaud it enough, and I can't tell people to go check it out enough. It's a really, really important outlet.
Thank you so much. That's high praise. I'm speechless. Thank you for having me on. Like I said, I've been a huge Revolutionary Rev Radio fan since you guys started, and I love the work you do. It's so important. And if you guys want to follow me on social media, I'm at Deep into History on Twitter, if it still exists when this show comes out, and at Deep into History. I'm around. I'm around.
Absolutely. And we'll link to that in the show notes. And hopefully this is just the first of many collaborations between you and I, my friend.
Absolutely. If your listeners would be interested, I would love to come and, just because I know you're a history buff too, talk about the fall of the Republic, the story that people don't know, which is the stories of Marius and Sulla, where all the norms that got torn down in our last 20 years, including the Iraq War, all these norms that apparently Trump, all these politicians broke, the same thing happened in the late Republic. And it took another 40 years before it actually fell to a dictatorship. So there's less, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And it's rhyming like crazy now with the late Republic.
Yes. That's fascinating. I would love to get more into ancient history on this podcast. I think we're definitely going to do something around our love of history and do future episodes going deeper into the historical past to try to better understand the present, because I truly believe you cannot understand yourself and you cannot understand the present state of things without a deep study of all of human history. I think it's a pillar of self-knowledge, and I think it's a pillar of just basic understanding of what's going on today, where we all came from, where the ideas that we're imprisoned by came from, and how certain patterns in human development repeat again and again and again. And if we can suss out those patterns and make sense of them, we can bolster our revolutionary theory and our strategies going forward.
For sure. And it's utterly enchanting.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, definitely.
It's the story of us, it's the story of us. And yeah, I always say the worst thing about death is that I don't get to see how the human story ends, because I'm so deeply invested in it. And I'm so fascinated by the entire story so far that I really wish, like, even before I blink out of existence, if you could just, if some deity could come down and let me know the end of the story, it'd be deeply appreciated.
Make a sacrifice to Apollo.
That's the move.
Perhaps
Okay.
the oracle will give you some insight.
It's worth a try. All right, my friend, until next time.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure.